we should not assume there is a loss for origin countries when high-skilled nationals are leaving. This has been the paradigm. Brain drain is the paradigm for most policymakers still today. For 20 years, we have seen evidence that this is the case, that there are potential positive gains for countries of origin when high-skilled people leave. But we know that the evidence exists. We know that it is not making the public policy discourse. So people still assume brain drain. And what we try to show is different areas, different mechanisms through which emigration of the highly skilled can benefit origin countries.
Welcome to Season 2 of Our Long Walk, a podcast series about South Africa's past, present and future. I'm Johan Fourie from Stellenbosch University, and as always, I'm joined by Wits University's brilliant Jonathan Schoots.
With Johan's expertise in economic history and my expertise in historical sociology, we are excited to interview world-leading academics who ask compelling questions about our country, our continent, and the ideas shaping the world around us.
Today's guest is Catia Batista, Professor of Economics at Nova School of Business and Economics in Portugal and founder of the NOVAFRICA Research Centre. Trained at the University of Chicago, her work uses field experiments to study migration, remittances, financial inclusion, and technology adoption.
She has carried out projects from Cape Verde to Kenya and has taught at leading universities, including Chicago, Oxford, and Trinity College Dublin.
Welcome, Catia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
It's lovely to have you here with us, Catia. I wanted to jump in and maybe start broadly and ask you about your work, how you got interested in mobile money, but also for the listeners, maybe you could bring us up to speed. You talk about how M-Pesa started in 2007. Where are we at today? What's going on with mobile money, the kind of growth of these platforms, and what this is doing in the African context?
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your question. And I guess what got me interested into mobile money was the explosive adoption in one country. That's where it started, and that's how it happened, right? In Kenya, M-Pesa started, and very quickly, over the course of 2 years, you had more than half of the population using it, 10% of GDP going through the service. So it caught my eye, let's put it that way. And so what we saw is that it was used a lot for transfers. So people, it has other purposes. And since then, we see it being used for many other purposes, instant payment. But where it started, the reason why it exploded so much in terms of adoption were remittances. People needing to send transfers and not having such a fast, reliable, cheap alternative. And that's how it started in Kenya. And because I've always worked on international migration, I thought this was really interesting because it was a way for us to see more remittances happening and maybe the well-being of people changing, which is always our ultimate goal. And so what happened was that in Kenya, it was so fast that no one could really evaluate its effects in a rigorous way. Like I like a lot doing experiments as a methodology to try and isolate the effects of innovation, say for development policy, for example. And so the opportunity here was that in Mozambique, I got to know that it was about to be launched in 2009. Okay, so it took some time before we got our project running, but so I knew that it was about to be launched. And so we started having these conversations to see if we could do an experimental introduction. To be clear, the company that was about to introduce mobile money in Mozambique wanted to start in urban areas. That's where they expected to make profit. Okay, so that was their motivation. And so what we did on the research side, and this is joint with Pedro Vicente, was that so we started talking to see if they would consider introducing this technology also in rural areas. And our idea was exactly that. There are strong migration corridors within the country. And so we could introduce it in the origin areas of migration, and we would see what would happen. Okay, so that was our initial thought process and how it started.
Yeah, I really love this, and I love the couple of papers focusing on this impact on rural areas. Your work is exploring, and I'm thinking particularly here, there's this Is Mobile Money Changing Rural Africa paper, thinking about how access to these kinds of financial services change remittances and saving, but also change people's practices around, say, consumption, investment, and migration here. So maybe you could say a little bit more. What do you see happening as people start to take this up?
Let me start by saying what were our theoretical hypotheses. Because we knew from the literature, say, about the impact of remittances, for example. What we expected to find was that if you introduce a new way for people to transfer money, say, from the city to the rural areas, you would see more local development. And that's how we started hypothesizing. Then what we did was we did the introduction of the service and we followed people over 3 years. And what we found was a bit the opposite. So what we found is that, for example, we would expect people to invest more in agriculture and agriculture modernization, for example, back home. But no, we started measuring precise negative effects. It was very puzzling because it was the opposite of what we expected. But then we started looking at other patterns. And what we realized was that people, once they have a way to provide for their families back home in rural areas, they decided to leave because the best use of their time was not to stay in that very traditional agriculture back home in these rural areas, it was to move to the city. Another thing that we show in this study is that when people were hit by negative shocks, I mean, it could be a disease in the family, some funeral, it could be something more. I mean, we also had floods. What we saw was that mobile money was really important in increasing remittances in times of hardship. Okay, so we saw that effect, but this was possible with people living in the city. I must say that before mobile money, this alternative did not exist. People in the city, and we are talking about, I mean, the same region, we are talking about migrants that were going to Maputo, the capital city of Mozambique, and they would need to travel back home, or they would need to trust their money, their transfer to a bus driver that would charge 20%. Half of the time, the money would not get there. Okay, so there was not really this alternative to provide for their families back home before. Once it did, people decided to leave. It was very surprising for us as well, and I think very interesting and a bit in line with the idea of structural transformation, right? So this has been happening for many centuries, I guess.
Yeah, Katja, I think, I mean, there's many different avenues to explore here. The one I want to get to, and then maybe this is, I don't want to be too technical here, but I mean, I do find it quite interesting, the kind of lab in the field experiments that you've done, right? This is not, when we think of development economics and people typically want to run RCTs, why the lab in the field approach? What does it involve? Maybe for the non-economists listening, what does that mean? And if you want to say something about internal validity and external validity, what is the benefits, advantages, and disadvantages of these lab experiments?
So in this case, what we did with mobile money, this was an RCT, classical one, which is very good in terms of internal validity, meaning we can identify causal effects in a very rigorous way. But then the question arises, so this worked for the southern areas of Mozambique. Will they apply elsewhere? So the external validity. And for this, we have to run more RCTs in other places. But what we can say, I think with some confidence, is that in other similar regions, and we have quite a few in at least sub-Saharan Southern Africa. So this is likely to be the case. Other areas that are very underserved in terms of supply of financial services are likely to have these results. Okay, we cannot say more than that. For that, we need more RCTs. Now, lab experiments, I've done a lot, actually not in this setting, but in settings where we want to test hypotheses, but not yet at large scale. For example, and here I'm going to switch topics a bit. So one of the contexts in which I've used lab experiments is irregular migration to Europe. So this is from West Africa. And so when we started, so this is work joint with Tijan Ba, now at the World Bank and a former PhD student of ours. So Tijan was telling me he's originally from one of these rural areas in the Gambia where the prevalence of irregular migration is one of the highest in West Africa. Also very rural and quite remote areas.
Yeah.
I mean, we were seeing many young people living in high numbers. And the first hypothesis we had was they must be misinformed. But of course, I mean, before you start a large-scale campaign of information and other policies, which we eventually did in RCT, what we thought is, let's see how people behave, how people respond to these pieces of information, and let's do that in a more controlled environment, okay? The drawback relative to an RCT is that these are hypothetical decisions. So typically what we do in lab experiments is that we gave proportional payments, so incentives for people to reveal the behavior that they would have in reality. But the drawback here is that these are hypothetical decisions, okay? We try to be as rigorous as we can. The effect, it's internally valid in the sense that the variation is created by the researcher, and so we can identify causal effects. The question there is more in terms of external validity. So we learn less, okay, we can infer less from lab experiments than full RCTs. So for example, in that case in the Gambia, what we found is that people responded to the information we were providing them as we expected, namely, they would reduce their irregular migration if they heard about higher mortality rates. They would migrate more if they knew that the asylum rates were higher as well. So this is all in direction we expected. Although what we also found in that experiment, which was quite interesting and also surprising, was that actually the potential migrants, so kids from age 15 to 25, they thought the mortality rates were higher than what we were giving them and what we thought it was reality. So what we learned in that lab experiment, I think very useful before any RCT, was that if we were just to tell them the actual mortality rate of irregular migration, they would have migrated more and not less. So we could be sending them in harm's way. So I think it's very important that we do lab experiments because they are rigorous, because they allow us to learn a lot, especially when you are, talking about these more ethically sensitive issues, for example, and context in which you want to learn more before you embark on a full-scale RCT, which takes a lot of years and big funding.
Yeah. We'll talk a lot more about immigration because I think it's a really fascinating policy question in Africa at the moment. But let's stay a little bit with the profession of development economics. So you're one of the leading development economists out there. You've just published, I should say, the paper that Jonathan mentioned earlier is in the Review of Economics and Statistics. You've just published a paper in Science. We'll get to that paper. But I've got a question about the methods that development economists use. These RCTs are also constrained to the kind of questions that some might say are at a limited scale. So you can't ask the kind of big development questions, right? How do we create growth? How do we create development, the big picture story? How do you test for innovation? It's always interesting that Africa is a relatively poor continent compared to the rest of the world. There's this need to develop, but of course we would want to see more formal firms being established, unemployment being addressed, but you can only do that with more market institutions. These are big questions which an RCT doesn't really seem to be able to capture. So how do you think about that trade-off between being very precise with a causal estimate, but perhaps a smaller question compared to these kind of bigger questions? Am I completely missing the boat?
No, that's a great question. And actually, it rings close to my personal career story. So let me say that when I did my PhD in Chicago, I did macro, I did growth. Exactly, these kind of big questions that always puzzle me, that I think are the motivation for me to be a development economist. These are the big questions. How do we get people, all of them, or a big chunk of them, to live better? Over time, and namely when I was at Oxford, when everyone was doing field work, I was a bit not so happy about these more macro economic growth models, because I felt that the level was too high to be able to draw policy implications, to make real changes in the field. I still think it is very important to look at the big picture, and I always have that. So in my papers, even though I do RCTs, I look at the mechanisms. My driver is always the big question. But this is really, as you were saying, it's a trade-off, a methodological approach, a methodological trade-off. So I think the big questions are important. I think it is hard at the very macro level to derive precise policy implications, but it is necessary work. I think nowadays, so I went more micro, more into the experimental methodology, trying to draw more precise policy implications, but I believe both things are important, obviously. The macro economic growth literature, I think a lot of the good economic growth literature is done with historical data, by the way, so close to you guys. And this is complementary to this other approach that development economists tend to take of looking at more specific questions. Of course, they are narrower, but I think together, if you combine what we learned from both perspectives, we can learn a little bit, make it move the frontier of knowledge.
One thing that I took from that work is this mobile money platform or the ease of remittances in general is not necessarily encouraging increasing economic investment in rural areas. It's allowing people to perhaps be more economically productive in urban areas and then send money back. And so that made me immediately think, exactly as you said before, this obviously offers a number of benefits, more wealth, being able to manage these shocks, all these kinds of things. But in the longer term, I wonder what that pattern means for rural development. And so I wonder, having done this work, seeing this perhaps decrease in investment in rural areas, do you have thoughts about what that implies and what policy should do around that?
Yes. So one result that is like not the main result of the paper, but I think is important to answer your question, is that so one positive outcome in terms of investment in rural areas is on education. There is more spending on educational supply, educational expenses. There is investment, namely in the kids that are left behind. I guess what we see happening here is that, well, remittances are providing for, say, better well-being back home. Okay, so what we see is people living better. And we know this is important, namely for education, right? And we see specifically more spending on education. So what I think is that those that are left behind, which can be elderly, females, kids, even though we don't distinguish these precisely, these are living better and maybe they are investing in their skills. But if I were to forecast what would happen, and we did not measure this, we only looked at the effects after 3 years, is that probably these better educated kids will end up also being migrants because that's where they find the best occupation. And so what we really see here is the pressure towards urbanization and mobile money as a channel for remittances is just accelerating, giving people the conditions to make this choice. I'm not sure this is the answer you were looking for, but that's what we see. It's not negative. People are living better at the origin. They're investing more in education, but then they choose to work in the city.
Catia, I mean, it's going to be interesting that this is obviously because of new technology, right? Access to mobiles and increasingly, I guess, also Wi-Fi. And it's, in some sense, it's also a private sector initiative. It's not really the state that's driving these kind of things. So what is the role of the state here? Is it to basically exit and not be involved? Or is there actually something that governments should be doing that they're not doing at the moment, or that they are doing, but they should be doing more of it?
Well, that's where the political economy comes in, right? It's not directly related. I can talk about it. So what could be the role of the state here? It could be in giving incentives for mobile money providers to be in these areas. These areas are isolated rural areas. They are not profitable. So we did this because it was a research project. And what we observed over 3 years is that the control areas, the areas where we did not have mobile money, well, mobile money was not going there. So we could compare, we could measure effects quite well over this time period because the mobile money company did not decide to invest in those areas because the investment cost is too high relative to the revenue or profit that they make. Okay, so the role of the state could be knowing that the availability of this technology benefits the rural population. They could invest in this. They could subsidize in some way access to technology by rural populations. But then again, this is where the political economy comes in because we know that many African governments are not so keen in having people leaving the rural areas and coming to the urban areas. And then we can comment on specific countries, but I think you know the pattern. There are many countries in which this is the case. Governments prefer people to stay behind, stay in rural areas, and not come to the challenges of the cities, right?
Yeah. Do you find that these migrants, so there's two components here. The one is migrants, so leaving the rural areas, moving to the urban areas, but then there's also migration or immigration out of the country. And so obviously governments might perceive this very differently. So let's talk about your science paper, I think, because that's a fascinating result. Sure. And maybe you could just summarize very briefly. It's also with a really impressive team of scholars. I'm not going to mention all of them, but it's clearly a massive project with very surprising results. What is the 2-minute version of that?
Okay. I think the short version is that we should not assume there is a loss for origin countries when high-skilled nationals are leaving. Okay, so this has been the paradigm. Brain drain is the paradigm for most policymakers still today. I must say that in this work, this article that we published in Science, we try to summarize evidence that has been produced for at least 20 years. So for 20 years, we have seen evidence that this is the case, that there are potential positive gains for countries of origin when high-skilled people leave. And this is why we have the opportunity to work with an amazing team of colleagues, okay? Because we're all concerned about the same. We know that the evidence exists. We know that it is not making the public policy discourse. Yeah. So people still assume brain drain. And what we try to show is different areas, different mechanisms through which emigration of the highly skilled can benefit origin countries. So I should say, this is by no means guaranteed. It will depend on context. It will depend on the conditions and the policies that governments put in place in origin countries. But there is surely the possibility that countries gain when those highly skilled people leave.
What was the reception to this paper?
Yeah, I don't think we had that many people disagreeing. Maybe they did, and we did not get to know. I would say. This is the problem. I mean, many people get to know about scientific evidence through social media. We are all in our different networks. And so maybe the people that were reading these and getting to know about these were more easily convinced than those in policy circles that are still convinced that brain drain is the thing. So this is something of concern. The reason why we tried to publish this article in Science was precisely that. Try to get to a broader audience that is not just development economists that already know about this. Okay, so the fact that you guys were reading it and considering is very good. I'm very happy about that. Thank you.
Even the sociologists are reading it.
Getting involved.
That is, I mean, I think all of us in this team of researchers, that's what we believe in, that we should spread the word so that we have policymakers in countries of origin think about this, think about what policies they might put in place to harness this emigration of highly skilled people.
I really love the kind of big picture model you paint here. And maybe I can say, okay, this is some of the pieces of the model that I took away and you could correct me here. But I think that the thing that I thought was really interesting, one of these drivers is people who want to leave train to gain the skills that they would need to leave, but only a sub portion of those people leave. And so many people remain behind. And so people are incentivized to gain those skills. But then even for those who leave, there are these positive flows back. So one positive flow is those who remain, but then there are these other positive flows back, remittances, return migration, knowledge transfer you talk about. And then that these kind of generate these positive goods in the context, increased human capital, possibilities for kind of innovation, trade linkages, business development. But also I found quite interesting socioeconomic and sociopolitical norms traveling back into the country through those, even from outside in the diaspora, but also people who return. So, I mean, is that kind of right? You know, for a broader audience, how would you paint the big picture of all that you bring together here?
Well, you said it already. It's a great summary. That's precisely, there are many different channels through which these positive effects come about. The first one is this positive incentive effect for human capital accumulation. The fact that you are in the origin country and you see highly skilled people going abroad, doing well, creates incentives for people to get more education. We have good examples by some of the co-authors in this article, say for nurses in the Philippines and IT engineers in India. So what we see is that when there are policy changes in the US that make it easier for them to immigrate there, what we see is that in the end, I mean, there are more nurses being trained, for example, in the Philippines, and that for one that leaves, you had 9 more in the country because they were more prone to get educated. Okay. Similar story for these engineers in India. So you also see the stock of people educated in the country increasing. Actually, this theory was developed in the 90s already, but it was not tested until about 20 years ago. Okay, but then we saw that, and we have been seeing different studies in different parts of the world that show that this is not just a theoretical possibility. We really see people getting more education because they think they might want to leave. In the end, more people end up staying than leaving. And so this idea that the brain drain is bad because you are losing the educated people might not be taking into account all the incentive effects that this outflow generates. So that's a mechanism number one on actually the number of people that end up staying in the country. Then, I mean, the other mechanisms explore what are the effects of those people that actually leave, the immigrants. And so what we see there, and you mentioned that, is that actually some of them end up coming back, the return migrants.
That's the Jonathan Schoots model. That's Jonathan leaving and then coming back again.
And so those people, they bring new skills, new norms. We see all of that. So I've actually worked a lot on political changes and gender norms And we do see that happening mostly through return migrants. But there is a caveat here. There is an important condition, which is these migrants, for there to be a positive effect, you need that these migrants are going to countries that have, we have to have opinions. So more positive norms. So if they go to more democratic countries where there is better governance, they import these norms, they learn about them, and when they come back, they transmit them. We often see the more inspiring politicians in Africa as well, they worked at some point abroad. Okay, so this is a practical example. But this also happens, say, with gender norms, fertility norms. And so these are people changing institutions. That's
the big picture. Yeah.
That is hard to change, we know. Going back to the macro. But this is a practical instance in which you see migrants going abroad, having experiences that change their experiences, their norms, their behaviors, and coming back, changing this. So we now have a body of evidence quite strong also in different contexts where we see that. It's also easy to see or easy to think that there is actually the fact that many of these people that leave, they get, some of them formal training, some training on the job. So when they come back, they are more prone to creating new businesses and businesses that have different organizations that are more productive. And so they help the country in this way. This, I think it's quite expected. I think the most surprising for most people is that even, if people are just abroad and stay abroad, they can still support the development of their country. These kind of norms that I was talking about, well, they also transfer to friendship. So we have a paper actually for Mozambique where we show people in Mozambique that have friends or family members outside of the country. And we see that friendships are particularly efficient transmitting these norms. We talked about political norms in that case. So we know that these relationships are so important. So when migrants are abroad, they can also bring change to their origin countries, provided they are in contact. So a very important thing for all of these is the contacts with the diaspora must be strong. If people live with their families, with everyone, and they are not in touch with their governments, local organizations or people, then this is lost. But if you can keep contact with your diaspora, you have these changes. It's also well documented investment, financial investment in the home country is well documented, and then trade relationships. So we have a lot of evidence about all of these. That does not mean it always happens. We know that there are contexts, especially the poorest countries, in which there are no education infrastructure. So university has very limited capacity, for example. The benefits of highly skilled people living are not universal by any means. What we have to think, or what policymakers may think, is how can I make this a positive phenomenon? Assuming that people are free to live, which I believe in, but it's not universal. So assuming that people are free to live, what can governments do to try and make this something positive? So first they should keep in touch. If they make it illegal and you don't have contact with these people, for sure it's a loss, right? But so keeping in contact with diasporas is very important. Then making sure that you have the educational capacity, to educate more people. If you have limited infrastructure for education and people want to get more education to live, then it's not possible. So this is something that needs to be supported. There is a range of policies that governments have that they can use to try and maximize the benefits of this high-skilled immigration. But I guess the key point, just to finish, is that it can really be positive. We should not just assume that when highly skilled people leave, it will harm the development of the origin country. There are many ways in which it can also help.
What I heard now is that South Africa should organize a massive homecoming event and then just invite the diaspora back. And even if they don't come permanently, but those links are incredibly strong.
Keep the connections.
The interesting thing that I've just realized is that in many professions in South Africa, certainly at the tertiary education level, we have supply constraints. So if I think of health professionals in South Africa, like many doctors would go to Canada or other Commonwealth countries after they've trained, but the supply is very limited. And the idea is that we don't want to overtrain too many doctors because there's only so many positions to fill in South Africa. But then many of these doctors then leave. So had we had more supply available, we might see far more take up of that. And that might not actually be a bad thing because some of them might stay, but many might leave. And that's also something that I found quite interesting, is that we don't typically think of the kind of regulatory implications of when we think about labor markets. We only tend to think about local labor markets and not really global labor labor markets.
The thing that was exciting for me was exactly the shift. We've had the assumption of negativity, so what about positivity? But from this new perspective, it made me think of potentially another avenue of challenge here, at least in some areas. So particularly with this question of skill development and knowledge transfer. This made me wonder, is there a challenge when your local country is most oriented around developing, say, skills and labor demands that are driven by elsewhere? It seems like everybody needs nurses, so an oversupply of nurses isn't a problem. But if you're incentivized to solve the problems of another wealthier country, and if you go and you gain knowledge that is most powerful in that country, does that kind of lead to a remnant for kind of significant gaps that maybe the most skilled people still are oriented towards, say, gaining the skills or creating the innovation that is anchored elsewhere? And there are these positive but almost accidental spillovers where, oh, you couldn't leave, so you stay behind, or you send that knowledge back, your family gains it. But all of that seems still to be very extroverted in its focus. Is there also a kind of challenge there that what remains is that the acquisition of skills and capacity is not oriented to the particular local needs or the innovative possibilities in a local context, et cetera, et cetera?
You are absolutely right. I think we mentioned that at the end of the article, saying that, there are several challenges and actually research gaps. Okay. And I think that is one of the challenges, is that it may happen that you have expanding training in skills that are not locally demanded. And that is a problem. Okay. So then the country will not be benefiting from that. So I agree with that. If I can put a little positivity into it, is that economies are dynamic. Maybe when you are training people that are very good, they are also entrepreneurial and capable of changing the local economy in a direction that is better for the country. Okay. But you are right. And I don't think there are no challenges here. There are certainly, and you pointed a very good one.
Great.
The one thing that struck me about your work is, let me start actually with a quote from a recent paper in economic history, where there was a survey of the field of African economic history. And one of the areas for development that was pointed out was the fact that there's almost no histories of Lusophone Africa. When I read it, I realized that's very true. I know one or two people, and the fact that I just know one or two people working on Mozambique or Angola means that it is quite rare. But your work obviously features Mozambique, it features Cape Verde. So what do we learn from Lusophone Africa that we wouldn't have known had we only studied British Africa or French Africa?
Let me go back to my personal professional history, because it has to do with that. I'm also a returned migrant. So I'm originally from Portugal. I'm now back in Portugal after 14 years abroad. The reason that brought me back to Portugal was to create this research center, NOVAFRICA, that is particularly focused on Portuguese-speaking African countries. And indeed, this did not exist. So we started in 2011. There was no research being produced in Portugal and in other countries as well, okay, about these countries in development economics. So we started doing this when we were away. We currently have a growing number of researchers working in these countries. I think Mozambique is especially more open. It has more, at least developing economists working these days, but these countries have always been a bit forgotten. Okay, and we know from the macro cross-country regressions that the colonial dummy, this is the worst, right? The Portuguese, the Lusophone countries are always the ones that performed worse. I think that it's partly, at least, because the colonization happened later. A lot of times in, not all, but many of these countries, there was civil war that obviously destroyed many of the conditions for economic development. And I guess this is one of the contributions. And indeed, when you look at scholars in economic development and related areas working in these countries, they often work on conflict, right? And the consequences of conflict, because you had civil wars in Angola, in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau, and these obviously affected trajectories up to today, okay? And we see these effects. So I think, of course, you have conflict, unfortunately, in many other areas of sub-Saharan Africa, but I think this is quite specific. The fact that the colonization happened so late, and the fact that in these countries which have most people in the Lusophone Africa, there was this conflict. So I think that's what we are learning the most from this context.
I've read, is it Stelios Michaelopoulos' work on landmines, or is it Elias Papanou? I think both of them might be involved in that project on landmines. And it just struck me very well, forcefully how landmines devastated Mozambique, but also the kind of the optimistic story of actually getting rid of the landmines and the immense economic benefit of that program of getting rid of the landmines. So certainly that I found very interesting.
One of the things of working in Lusophone Africa is that some of these are the poorest countries in the world and in Africa. And the positive side to it is that what we are looking for is for development policy interventions that can make a difference, because when you start this low, our hope is that we can find things that work, that can be scaled up and really make a difference, because these countries are starting from such a low point.
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of your papers, and so we're going to play a game, and that is for you to identify the papers in the song that we're going to play now. So we've created a song for you about your research.
I'm not good at this.
I must warn you that the lyrics in this song, the first verse might be quite tough to follow, but just hang in there and then hopefully you'll get most of the papers correctly. So I'm going to play the song and then afterwards I'm going to ask you which papers they refer to.
Oh dear.
Creole on the beat, young ones chase Lisboa skies, but the facts ain't straight, they believe in bigger lies.
Okay, Catia.
This is the irregular migration paper.
Scholarships and pass rates change who takes that flight when school is paid for. More will cross that line, but honest info means less dropout in time.
Yes, this is about Cape Verde paper, about where we give information to students.
From Ghana to India, skills don't fade away. New schools
And this is the science paper. It's easy.
Knowledge, trade and deals. Returnees build businesses, change the way it feels. The migrant gains the most, but the home can grow if leaders back education.
Yeah, this is all about the science paper. It's very nice.
Truth on the wire, from back way to higher. We learn, return and inspire. Truth on the wire, from back way to higher.
Return and inspire. It's so pervasive in my research. I don't know which paper this is.
That's the chorus.
Return, migration and politics, maybe.
Remittances arrive, food stays steady, families survive, but with less farm work.
And this is the mobile money, I guess.
Transfers push them down a new mode. At first it looks small, just a shop or two, but check it again, returnees break through. Back from abroad, they open and they trade. The numbers are bigger once the
Return, migration and business creation.
the workers roam. They'll watch them return and invest back home. Truth on the wire. Truth on the wire, from back way to higher. We learn, earn, return and inspire.
One more.
Truth on the wire, from back way to higher. We learn, earn, return and inspire. Maninga drums talk, risk on the street. You think that this higher than it really be. Dream of permits, odds, looks.
This is about irregular migration. It's the Gavia paper.
Is wrong. Give them the truth and their choices shift. Safer roads ahead, that's the gift. Truth on the wire, from back way to higher. We learn, earn, return and inspire.
And I said, this was brilliant. Thank you so much, really. This was my best podcast ever. And I've done a series, okay?
Catia, maybe I can just give you a quick rundown of how we created that. Given that you're from Portugal, I assumed Fado music would be important. So there's a bit of Fado in there. There's, of course, the rap and some one or two kind of quirky instruments. But basically, I took these 4 papers, asked ChatGPT to write some rap verse for that, and then threw that into Suno, and that is the music. Maybe for the listeners, should we check whether you've got it correctly? I hope you made notes.
Of course. So the last one was the paper on irregular migration, probably the JDE, where we tested different policies for irregular migration in the Gambia. Then there was the one on mobile money, the rest that we were discussing on remittances and people leaving, making a difference in their lives and compensating for small shocks. It was there, I heard.
Yeah.
We're also talking about return migrants and how they affect business formation. That's for Mozambican migrants to South Africa, precisely.
Yes.
Now I'm trying to move backward. Let me see if I get it right. I think we talked about also inspiring people. And so that could be either the JD article on Cape Verde, that was the first one in 2012, or it could be about the science that we now publish, because they both have these elements. And for sure, there was more about the science article. So I think maybe I'll choose these 5.
Okay. No, I think you've got it spot on.
Thank you so much.
I really love this. I loved also this return and inspire theme. So in addition to that, you were saying is there are people who are returning and even people in the diaspora are kind of powerfully contributing.
Yeah, I think that's a powerful message. Indeed, in my latest research, some of which is not yet published, we work a lot on these aspirations and we use role models a lot. So I've used this in Mozambique to inspire micro-entrepreneurs. I've used it actually in schools here in Portugal where immigrant populations could benefit from these. And I've also been working with a lot of migrant population with this idea of aspiring. Do you want me to tell some preliminary results still? No.
Yes.
Sure, that'd be great.
That was actually my question that Jonathan stole. So please, what are you working on at the moment?
A lot of this work is still ongoing. Okay, so we are still collecting data and analyzing for results. But actually, some work that we did with Cape Verde and immigrants in Portugal, where we compared, providing them, we have this app giving information on immigrants on how they can get legal status, look for job, look for housing. And we also had an inspirational documentary, okay, of success stories. Because oftentimes when Africans arrive to Europe, they feel stigmatized, they feel put aside, and they don't have maybe enough aspirations to do better. And so we tried these two interventions. What we saw was that providing this informational app where people get information on how to do things, raise their aspirations as much as the role models, but they could do better because they had the tools. And okay, here it's not a very optimistic message, but it's one in which we have to give the tools for people when they leave their countries to do better, because integration is also the way for everyone to do better. Migrants while they are abroad, and then of course their families back home. And we actually see that when we gave immigrants information, we saw that they were doing better with better jobs, happier in the destination country. And then we interviewed their family members back home, and those were voting more. Okay. And they had gender norms that were more egalitarian. Okay. All of these with improving integration. But unfortunately, raising aspirations was not enough. We have to do more than that.
Fascinating. Yes. We have another tradition, and this is where we asked ChatGPT to ask you a somewhat quirky question. And I must say, I was slightly disappointed in ChatGPT's ability to ask quirky questions. They seemed to be a bit bland. Maybe it was my prompt. Given that you are doing a lot of field work on the continent, I think the one that struck me here was just, is there an inspiring moment, something that happened in the field, which made you realize something new that you wouldn't have had sitting in a desk in Lisbon? I remember at Stellenbosch, we had a development economist many years ago who said that a development economist who doesn't actually get his hands dirty in the field shouldn't really call themselves a development economist. That's paraphrasing it. But what did you learn in the field that you wouldn't have learned in the classroom?
I'm not sure I have a single story to tell, but all of my work is based on that. We never do the big RCT before being in the field, talking to people, piloting, collecting qualitative data. It's a part of the work. So let me go back again to this work in the Gambia on irregular migration. So I was working with Tijat, so he was my PhD student. He was originally from these areas, and even him, he was surprised with what we were finding, okay? So this means that bringing these rigorous economic methodologies to the field, even by the hand of someone that is originally from there, can yield insights.
So let me follow up that with a more quirky one, which kind of speaks to this, and that is that, where's this? If Mozart had been born in Cape Verde today, would he have left for Lisbon on a scholarship or stayed home and opened a fintech startup?
I think he would have come to Lisbon, and the whole experience of migration, the way it changes people, I think would be yielding inspiring music. So it would not be worse off.
Fantastic. Catia Batista, thank you very much for joining us on this 4th episode of Season 2 of the Our Long Walk podcast. Thanks, Jonathan, for being here. And we'll be back in another couple of weeks.
Yeah,
thanks.
Lovely to have this conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Season 2 of the Our Long Walk podcast. We'd love to hear from you. What's the one idea from today's conversation that changed your outlook? Do you have a burning question you'd like to explore, or perhaps a guest you'd love to hear from? Get in touch with us by sending an email to johan@ourlongwalk.com. That's JOHAN@ourlongwalk.com.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. You can follow us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we'd love your feedback. Visit us at ourlongwalk.com. Follow our LinkedIn page for updates, new episodes, and additional links.
This series is made possible by the Chair in Economics, History and Policy at Stellenbosch University. Visit leapstellenbosch.org for more information about our research unit in economic history.
Thanks to LEAP researcher Kelsey Lemon, who provided helpful background research. Thanks also to the team at Voice Note Productions for helping to make this podcast. Our producer is Vasti Calitz. Sound design and editing is done by Andri Burnett. Nkosi Johan.
Dankie, Jonathan. Join us next time for another episode of Our Long Walk.
See you then.
Cheers.